the whites cut out. They flee to the suburbs. And the community that you thought you were integrating soon becomes another all-black slum, another all-black ghetto.
We want black power.
How can you tell black people to leave on violence and at the same time condone the sending of white killers into the black communities?
At a protest in Greenwood, Mississippi, 1966, Kwame Ture made a call for black power, for change and revolution. His call was heard and a new movement was formed. Black Power became, as Keto Swan writes in Black Power's Global Pulse, a rallying cry for black youth across the United States. A rallying cry for black people to reject institutional racism and white American values, and instead redefine themselves, celebrate their heritage, and self-govern their own communities and organizations. 51 years later, the Black Power movement is still largely understood and discussed in the context of U.S. politics, and as one defining moment in African American history. It's often juxtaposed with the civil rights movement as embodying a much more radical and violent ideology, especially in connection to the Black Panther Party. Although the term itself is most closely associated with Kwame Ture and the BPP, the concept of Black Power and what it embodies did not originate solely from him. Nor is it a movement that occurred in isolation, separate from the civil rights movement in the US and separate from the history of the world. Instead, it could be argued that Black Power has existed in different iterations throughout African American history, and that it reaches far beyond the borders of the United States. Black Power has always been and still is a global experience. In this film, Global Solidarity, together with you, will travel across the world and through time to explore how Black Power has historically been conceptualized and expressed by 4 different nations in their own struggle for equality and in solidarity with other nations and the U.S. Black Power movement.
Hello, my name is Kwadwo Asenso. I will be discussing Black Power in the international arena in Ghana, West Africa. Ghana is a West African country that has been integral in the international fight for Black Power. Leaders who advocated for Black Power, such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, recognized the importance of Ghana in the Black Power struggle and made it a point to visit the country. They visited Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah, a leader who helped lead Ghana to independence. The most important part of Ghanaian history as a part of Black Power in the international arena is Independence Day, which occurred on March 6, 1957. This independence was a large part of the overall decolonization of Africa. The Ghanaian people were throwing off the chains that the British Empire had put on them and were going forward to determine and take charge of their own lives as Black people. This also served as a precedent for many African countries to break free from colonial rule. On Independence Day, Ghanaian leader Nkrumah himself said that our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. Nkrumah was an American-educated Pan-Africanist and understood that the liberation of Black peoples in his country would be a sounding call for Black people and Black Power worldwide. Ghana's former name, Gold Coast, named this because of the gold that was found there, which changed to Ghana. The name Ghana means warrior king. This changed Ghana from a place named for what it was exploited for to a name that represented the strong mentality of the Black people and Black Power in the country. The Ghanaian flag itself represents the Black Power struggle for freedom from Britain in the country. The red represents the blood of Black people that was shed for Black independence. The yellow represents the wealth of the country. The green represents the lush vegetation enforced in Ghana. And the black star represents the Black people that fought for independence in the country and is why the Ghanaian national teams, such as the soccer team, are known as Black Stars. Inspired by the Ghanaian example of Black Power in the international arena, More than 30 African countries broke free from colonial rule that decade, and the flag of the country of Guinea-Bissau that won independence in 1973 was influenced by the design of Ghana's flag. Ghana's independence was a big example of Black power in the international arena, and it inspired people across the international arena to continue struggling for Black power.
In 1962, Algeria achieved independence from decades-old French colonialism after a long struggle led by the National Liberation Front. After achieving independence, Houari Boumediene became the second president of Algeria. He was an anti-colonialist who sought to maintain unity among African nations. The Algerian Revolution was one example of working to overcome racism and imperialism and inspired many revolutionaries to relocate in Algiers. Kathleen Neal Cleaver wrote that the film The Battle of Algiers forced many Black revolutionaries in America to identify with those fighting for national liberation. With Boumediene as president, Algeria became a haven for revolutionaries and anti-colonial fighters from all over the world. One prominent member of the Black Panther Party, Eldridge Cleaver, fled the U.S. after being involved in a shootout in California. Eldridge eventually arrived in Algeria, where he would set up the international section of the Black Panther Party on the outskirts of Algiers in 1970. Boumediene offered monthly stipends to groups dedicated to overthrowing colonial masters, and it was through those stipends that Eldridge was able to create the international section of the Black Panther Party. In an essay titled Art and Revolution by Eldridge Cleaver's wife, Kathleen Neal, she described the Algerian victory over French imperialism as a catalyst to the battle for self-determination and civil rights for Black people around the world. She wrote, "Visiting Algiers became almost a kind of pilgrimage for Black revolutionaries in 1969. Before the opening of the international section of the Black Panther Party, Eldridge, his wife, and other prominent Black Panther leaders participated in the 12-day-long Pan-African Cultural Festival in July 1969. Eldridge and Kathleen arrived the evening before the festival, and to many his arrival represented a symbolic triumph over America's racist power, Kathleen wrote. Kathleen also wrote in her essay that musicians, dancers, horsemen, poets and painters, writers, filmmakers, scholars, and political leaders filled the city's hotels for the festival. William Klein, a filmmaker, shot the film for the festival. A reviewer of the film wrote, "The radical atmosphere of a few summer days is captured in the film, which shows that this Pan-African gathering was a genuine meeting of African cultures united in their denunciations of colonialism and fights for freedom." William Klein would later work with Eldridge's friend Robert Shear to make a documentary about Eldridge and the Black Panther Party, mostly based in Algeria. The Pan-African Cultural Festival represents an important moment not only in the Black Power movement in Algeria, but internationally as well. People came from all over the world to form community for the festival, and it displayed important aspects of African culture that are essential to understanding how culture can be a means to raise consciousness when colonialism, imperialism, and racism still exist in every corner of the world.
Paul Cuffey, a wealthy Quaker ship owner of African Americans and Native Americans, actively protested for freed slaves having the ability to settle in Africa. This was supported by members of Congress, Black activists in the U.S., and the British government. They planned to take freed blacks to the British colony of Sierra Leone. By 1816, Paul Cuffey brought 38 African Americans to Freetown, Sierra Leone, but went on to pass away the following year of 1817. Paul Cuffey's work did not go unacknowledged. His work eventually became the blueprint for the American Colonization Society, also known as the ACS. In 1822, Jehudi Ashman, an editor for ACS, went to Africa and became an early activist in the Liberian community. He wanted Liberia to be an American empire in Africa. In order to accomplish this dream, in 1825 and 1826, he began to take small strides to lease, annex, and or buy tribal lands along the coast and major rivers of Africa. Ashman was willing to use weapons to help him force others to give up their land so that Liberia can expand their territory. This led to Liberia's growth and empire. On May 11th of 1825, King Peter and other nearby African leaders signed a treaty with ACS for 500 bars of tobacco, 3 barrels of rum, 5 casks of powder, 5 umbrellas, 10 iron posts, 10 pairs of shoes, and other items for the selling of their land. In 1850, Virginia and several other states helped support the ACS by giving them $30,000 per year for 5 years. This was done as a result of failure for the U.S. Congress to send funds to help support Liberian civilizations. By the 1840s, it became financially hard for the ACS to support Liberia. At this time, Liberia was facing serious political conflicts with Britain due to its unidentification of sovereign power. This led to the U.S. to neglect sovereignty over Liberia. In 1846, the ACS forced Liberian settlers to claim their own independence, thus making it its own country.
During the 1960s, strong ties of mutual support developed between the Black Panther Party and the revolutionary government of Cuba. The start of the Cuban Revolution brought high levels of economic equality, which also created levels of racial equality that had not been seen in Cuban history. By dismantling informal segregation and increasing equality of opportunity for non-whites, the Cuban government claimed that Cuba was a racial democracy, more than any other country in the hemisphere at the time. This was particularly true because of the anti-racist philosophy that was created so that those who considered themselves to be revolutionary could not exhibit racist attitudes or conduct discriminatory practices. Racism, both individual and structural, was deemed a thing of the past, and any policy enacted to prevent racial inequality was considered unnecessary. Many Black radicals considered the Cuban Revolution as a third world revolution which fought against United States imperialism on the American continent. On one hand, these Black militants embraced ethnic nationalism at home, but on the other hand, they also supported the third world internationalism abroad. In September 1960, the 15th United States General Assembly functioned as the stage for the historic meeting between Fidel Castro and Malcolm X. When Castro and the Cuban delegation arrived in Manhattan on September 18th, several hotels refused to offer them accommodation because they did not want to host a delegation from a quote-unquote hostile country. After hours of tension, which included Castro's threat to camp in Central Park, the Cubans gladly accepted the invitation of Malcolm X to stay at the Teresa Hotel in Harlem.
The historical memory of Fidel having met in the Teresa Hotel with Malcolm is still so much a part of Harlem culture that when I heard that he was planning to visit Harlem, I said, no matter where I am, anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, I will definitely try to be in Harlem.
On his arrival, Castro was welcomed by thousands of people who felt that they were more fairly represented by him, a third world leader, than by their own government. Moments after his arrival at the Teresa, Fidel talked to Malcolm X in his room. During the half-hour-long meeting, the two leaders discussed the Black struggle in the United States, the Congo leader and martyr for the wider Pan-African movement, Patrice Lumumba, who was seen earlier in this film, being arrested after winning the Congo elections in May 1960, and Castro's intention to focus his speech at the General Assembly on decolonization and the Third World. The meeting between Castro and the most prominent leader of the black militants had a highly symbolic meaning and ratified the alliance between black radicalism and revolutionary Cuba. Most of the black radicals who supported the Cuban Revolution in the Six Ties praised Guevara's tactics of guerrilla warfare and considered this guerrilla strategy as a possible response to daily racial oppression. Cuba also became a safe place for those Panthers who wanted to escape from the illegal activities of John Edgar Hoover's counterintelligence program, and starting from 1967 to 1968, dozens of Black Panther Party members went into exile in Cuba. Among the African Americans in exile in Cuba, there were some of the most prominent leaders of the Black Power movement, such as Eldridge Cleaver, Huey P. Newton, and Assata Shakur. For many Black Panthers, Cuba symbolized a perfect example of how a socialist system could succeed in offering equal opportunities to all its citizens. The alliance with Cuba enabled many Black radicals to internationalize their struggle by linking the African American quest for human rights to the worldwide struggle of the dark races against imperialism and colonialism.
As we can see in the example of Liberia, ideas about Black power imbued Black consciousness around the world even before Kwame Ture made the same call to young African Americans. Moving into the 20th century, Ghana's liberation from the British Empire was the spark that paved the way for other African countries to battle for their right to independence and freedom. 6 years later, Algeria broke free from French imperialism and became a global refugee for Black revolutionaries, establishing themselves as an international ally for Black power. However, Algeria was not the only nation to show solidarity with Black power on an international scale, as illustrated by the continuing discourse and cooperation between Fidel Castro and prominent African American political figures, as well as Cuba's support of the Black Panther Party. These four instances exemplified the vast reach of Black power, which both embodied the unique experiences of Black people within different nations, influenced by local and national circumstances, yet at the same time globally uniting them in their struggle for freedom and equality. As Brenda Gale Plummer writes in International Dimensions of the Black Power Movement, Black Power was an international movement that, in voicing common elements within the experiences of African and Africa-descendant diaspora peoples, provided a framework that helped define their grievances and goals. The Black Power movement was not just a U.S. experience. It traveled both through time and across the world, evolving into much more than a political ideology.